Welcome to the Red Rose Film Club, a movie podcast that examines the wide world of cinema through our perpetually lefty pinko commie soy boy cuck Antifa super soldier filter, but more specifically, we love movies and want to create a podcast that would appeal to the disparate tastes of our liberal, leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist, and Leninist friends. Red Rose Film Club is for leftists of all stripes who don't know what to talk about at parties other than movies and politics. My name is Craig. I work in public education and am passionate about social justice and workers' rights. And I'm with...
Hey, I'm Hal. I'm switching it up and taking it back to the basics in 2024. I'm a socialist trying to grapple with our world by reflecting on it through art, theory, and the will of the people. Before we jump into our standard bits and gimmicks, want to have a little announcement session because there's some stuff going on. So
especially for our Tallahassee folks.
Yes, a lot of all of this relates
all
to
of it, but for wherever you are, feel free to come to Tallahassee for any of these things.
So the first is that because this episode you're going to post it tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yes.
Yes.
So
okay. So this episode will be posted on Sunday, July 14th, 2024. If you are hearing this right after it came out within that week, on Saturday, July 20th, 2024, that is the 55th anniversary of the moon landing.
Moon landing.
Yes, the Apollo 11
with
moon
air
landing.
quotes.
And so I know some really cool people that make some really dope music that reminds me of space. And human discovery and the contradictions contained therein. And so we're hosting a show. I'm calling it A Space Happening.
Hell yeah.
Like a Warhol factory happening, right? And I will be doing a spoken word vocal performance. You're not allowed to laugh at my bad moon poetry. And Chantal Dorsey, Joe Kalicki, and Addison Kane are going to play music, like experimental music during the show. And then Dave Rodriguez is going to do some really dope video art. So coming out. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that the Tallahassee Film Festival, which this year is August 31st and September 1st, 2024, tickets just dropped. There's some exciting stuff happening. I can tell you there's a lot of cool stuff happening in the shorts section in particular that I'm enthusiastic about. But also they've announced that the showcase feature, which is always like, a blast from the past, is Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas. One of
the all-time greats.
Yes.
I love that movie.
Featuring, of course, Harry Dean Stanton. So
and
I'll be there.
Tasha Kinski, is that her name?
I think so.
Did I get it right? Yeah.
So I'll be there. Come say hello, and get your tickets now before they go up slightly in price. How about you, Craig? I think you have an announcement to make as well.
We talked about these before, but I do our friend Kevin at Cap City Video Lounge here in Tallahassee has been gracious enough to kind of let me have First Fridays to program movies that I'm interested in, usually from some sort of political angle. And we took a little bit of a hiatus the last several months, but we're back. You already missed the one for July, so sorry, but we watched Taxi Driver. And then coming up in August, the first Friday in August, which I think is August 2nd. Let me double check that.
Sounds
yes,
right.
August 2nd is Observe and Report, which I think will be a fun one because I don't know if we've done any.
Are you promoting propaganda?
No, I think this might be one of our movies. This was the episode that you weren't on with the folks from I Don't Speak German, where we were trying to think of non-propaganda cop movies, and this might be the one.
I was also just making reference to the massive fracas around Miami Vice that happened on Twitter
I don't know
week.
This.
Yeah,
Miami Vice, the Michael Mann?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Someone said that he showed his girlfriend Miami Vice, a film critic who I quite like and have followed on Twitter for quite some time, and it exploded. People were losing their minds.
Okay.
I
haven't seen it recently enough to...
I mean, regardless of whether or not it's propaganda, the response was disproportionate. So I was just trying to make a joke.
Okay.
But,
I'm gonna look into that then, because I love Michael Mann, and I want to see what idiots online are saying.
In response to it, the IFC Center in New York brought a screening of it back. That's how.
Oh, okay. So people were overwhelmed
online.
Okay,
everyone is.
I can see the direction of this argument now.
Yes.
Maybe I don't want to look into this.
Yeah. Just watch the movie. Don't look into it.
And then September's first Friday, which will be September 6th, we're going to watch Gaza Mon Amour, which is one that I've never seen. Have you seen it?
I have not.
Yeah, so I'm excited to see that one. But yeah, so those are our events that we have coming up here in Tallahassee.
Damn. I'm going to be gone. My sister's bachelorette party.
Hey, well, maybe Gaza Mon Amour for a bachelorette party.
Sure.
Bring the... Actually, I do think of what I know about the movie. It's a romance about an elderly couple in Gaza. So I don't think it's gonna be too heavy, if that's maybe not your thing to watch something super heavy. But yeah.
Exclusively heavy things, please.
Hell yeah. I mean, me. Yeah. Which... If we want to get into pop culture.
Why don't you go ahead and lead into what other pop culture you're getting into these days, Craig?
Yeah, so I've been in Chicago for the last week or so I haven't watched a lot, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I did watch a movie that I want to see if you saw, which was In a Violent Nature.
I have not, but I can't wait to hear. I'm familiar with it, and I can't wait to hear what your thoughts are.
Fucking disgusting.
Oh, sick.
And maybe two of the most disgusting kills I've ever seen in a movie. My wife and I were talking about what was more disgusting, this or Terrifier 2. And I think it landed on Terrifier 2, but only by a hair.
Or like a droplet, as it were.
A droplet, yeah. But do you know the conceit of In a Violent Nature?
I mean, I know it is classic stalking.
It's a classic slasher movie. It's not really doing anything plot-wise. It's not doing anything like a slasher in the woods, killing college kids, except that almost the entire movie is told from the perspective of the slasher. So most of the movie, the camera is behind him, following him, just tromping through the woods and picking up on what would be the plot points in a regular slasher of oh, Timmy, you just are trying to get in my pants or whatever. Him picking that up on the periphery as he's just kind of stalking these people.
So it's kind of inverting it. How in a classic slasher you would have
yes,
these moments of taking the perspective, in the classic horror theoretical text, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, where you occupy the perspective of the murderer. Instead, that is what's foregrounded.
Yes.
And everything else is popping up.
And the tropes
flashes.
are I think intentionally cheesy and cliche because they don't play as large of a role because you're just hearing it from the the background, and then it allows you to fill in kind of what you know from having watched all of these movies, you don't have to do as much legwork because it kind of relies on you knowing these tropes and things.
Well, and I imagine also on some level that if that's what you're hearing, it's because the murderer can only interpret human relations.
Right. Yeah.
In those splashy, unrefined, unnuanced ways.
Yeah. And there's no score in it too.
Interesting.
So it's just a lot of him clomp, clomp, clomp. And then, a lot of, I will say Terrifier, if we're going to compare the two, Terrifier is more consistently disgusting, whereas this movie is slow burn, slow burn, slow burn. 30 seconds of the nastiest shit I've ever seen, and then more slow burn.
I'll have to find someone to watch with because that is absolute. Mike does not like horror movies in general, and sometimes I can convince him for things that are he liked The Witch, right, or whatever.
Hell
but that is not. I do not think something.
Yeah, if you don't like gore, it's gross.
Watch.
It's gross.
It's not even gore. I think it's the tone. He doesn't like the suspense being intensified to such a degree that it is exclusively what is foregrounded as the tone of the movie. But so
I will say
someone else to get nasty with me.
It has the ending I think is kind of a miss for me.
Okay.
It tries to do it's very meta. The movie is meta just by nature. It's a genre exercise in general. And then the ending just does a thing where it kind of switches perspective in a way that it hadn't done before, that I think kind of undercuts what it's trying to do as a genre exercise. So I don't love the ending, but just as a genre exercise itself, most of the movie is pretty cool.
Dope.
But the other thing I want to talk about is my Chicago trip, which I guess I'm going to let bleed over into my current events section because a lot of this is not really that pop culture-y.
Who fucking cares? It's our podcast.
Yeah.
Talk about what you want to talk about.
But Chicago was fun. First off, I saw a lot of baseball games.
Nice.
I went to 1 Cubs game and 2 White Sox games. That was a doubleheader that we didn't know about.
Sick.
And, oh my God, Cubs tickets. 3 of us. We paid with fees and all that, $160.
Okay.
White Sox tickets. 4 of us went, doubleheader, $22. So the White Sox
generally
are
my experience.
struggling.
Generally my experience. I have been to Cubbies games and White Sox games as well during my times.
It was a little
Wrigleyville
sad.
is really. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I like it. I appreciate something I really like about sports in a big city is being able to, as someone who's maybe not. I love a lot of things that are contained within big cities, but it's not where I wish to be. That's why I live in Tallahassee, Florida. But I do really love the experience of like you are on the street and like you can hear the game. Like you know,
it's cool. Like that part
the
of
juxtaposition.
Wrigleyville's awesome. I had a lot of fun the White Sox game, but it's like in the South Side, nothing around it. It's just you're going to a White Sox game. That's all you're doing. So yeah, the stadium experiences are not. Wrigley's definitely like more fun. However, at the White Sox game, I saw something really cool that, sorry, I'm going to talk baseball for a minute, but I saw an immaculate inning. Do you know what an immaculate inning is?
I assume that's something that is like attached to a statistical achievement.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's fairly rare, but not like the most rare thing. But, you know, it takes 3 pitches to strike somebody out. An immaculate inning is you strike out all 3 batters.
So it's 9
with
it's just
3
straight
pitches
9
each. So yeah,
strikes in a row.
And the first White Sox game we saw, their closer Michael Kopech had an immaculate inning through 9 pitches, 3 strikeouts, which was pretty cool.
That's exciting. I mean, as we've talked about before, I'm not a baseball fan.
Yeah.
At all, but that. You know, again, the boundaries of human experience are of interest to me, and it's really cool when people can achieve at the pinnacle of their field and accomplish something really.
Yeah,
really
and
cool.
Baseball has so many of those little stupid records that nobody ever thinks about.
Yes,
but
many
yeah,
opportunities. It's very slow.
I also got yelled at Wrigley.
Oh.
I got in a little. Now I feel like any way I tell this, I'm gonna sound like an asshole, like trying to, but. Okay, so I really wanted to see the Bartman seat at Wrigley. Do you know Bartman? Steve Bartman. I'll give you the quick rundown.
Yeah, go ahead.
2003.
Go ahead, tell me.
Remember, the Cubs went 100 years without winning before they won in 2016. So 2003, it had almost been 100 years that they hadn't won a World Series, and they were in the National League Championship Series, which was win this, you go to the World Series. They were up 3-1. They were fucking crushing it, and then late in that game. A Marlins player who they're playing hit a foul ball that was straddling the line between the stands and the field, and the Cubs outfielder Moises Alou ran to the stands and went to catch it, and a Cubs fan who was also trying to catch it hit it first, and Moises Alou didn't make the catch. And from that moment, the game just kind of deteriorated for the Cubs, and then the Cubs went on to lose that series. And that guy, Steve Bartman, the fan, became like public enemy number 1 in Chicago. Like he went into hiding. He had to like get escorted out of the stadium, but it's just become it's just become like baseball lore.
Very quickly, Chicago fans turned into Philly fans.
Yeah,
I mean that shit.
It was also like he did mess up, but like he wasn't intentionally doing it. If you watch it, he was just trying to catch a foul ball, and then also like. The part that gets forgotten is the Cubs also like shit the bed for the rest of that series afterwards.
I mean, like it's because series are 7,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously not that one man's fault,
but he took all the heat for it. Yeah. So I wanted to go sit like I want to go get my picture taken in the Bartman seat after the game, and we were there with a group, and like I had kind of run ahead because I was like, oh, they're trying to escort people out, and I was like, so I went to this old man who was like one of the guys that was like, all right, everybody out, and I knew like I was kind of breaking the rules, so I was trying to be jovial, but I was like, I want to see the Bartman seat, like trying to get him on my side. I was like, let me see the Bartman seat, and he's like, no, everybody go. And I was like, okay. So I turn around to go, and he starts like kind of walking behind me, and he's like, let's go, and I was like, buddy, I'm going. And then we were trying to like re-meet our group, which were like up here, but there was an exit closer, so I was like, all right, let's go meet our group, and he's like, nope, exit right here. And I was like, buddy, we're here with a group. He's like, this is the exit, and this is just an old man who like is an usher. And I was like,
he's very invested in his
role. And then like 2 of his buddies come over and are like, what's going on here? And I was like, fellas, we got it. We're going to go meet our friends if that's all right with you. And he was like, let's go. And finally, then I started being a dick because then I just started I was like, I'm going to go meet my friends that are up there. Are you okay with that, sir? And then every step I was like, am I still okay? So I was being a real dickhead to this guy. But he annoyed me.
It was devolving.
And I didn't get to see the parkman seat.
I don't think I've short story. I think it was at a White Sox game. Would have been like 5 years ago, almost exactly. And Mike and I were there with two of our friends, and it was $1 hot dog.
Oh, hell yeah.
Okay. So I was excited because I was like, this is a thing that I can care about. I love hot dogs.
I do too, but I'm not going to put goddamn tomatoes on it and everything else that these Chicago people want.
I do like a Chicago dog, but if I'm getting a dog like in a place at Costco or like in a sports game where it's like a quick somebody's passing by or I'm on the move with it, I raw dog the dog, no ketchup even. I thought
you meant like no bun too.
No. Well, relatedly, so it's $1 hot dog day. We're sitting, they send folks through the dudes that shout, with the boxes strapped to their chest. And we are sitting in like the cheapest seats. It is the hottest day. I mean, it is like I'm covered in sunscreen, just sweating my ass off. It's dripping off my face. And we see a group of young men in front of us. Every single one of them orders a hot dog. We order hot dogs. The guy walks away. And in front of us, we notice that these very drunk young men have all opened their dogs, and one of the men got a dog that was just a bun. It had no hot dog in it.
Wait, what? That's what he ordered? This was
No.
intentional? Oh, I was going to say.
Because they're wrapped up. He just is like handing them out quickly.
God
and
damn.
the guy had walked away already, and they had all opened them.
That's funny.
And he got no dog. And the look on his face, it was like he was
I can
transported to childhood. You know?
If you're drunk and that happens, that is
I'll never forget.
Yeah.
And then they're standing up, they're calling. The guy is like long gone. It was just a tragedy in 3 acts in front of us, and I will never forget
That's
it.
awesome. I love that.
So what else did you get into in Chicago?
So I did like a lot of the Chicago stuff. We went to the Art Institute and
Love it.
Cloud Gate, saw the big
Did you
mirror
go to
beam.
the MCA?
What is
Museum
that?
of Contemporary Art?
We did not. We the Field Museum was the other one that we wanted to do because we didn't have that.
To see Sue?
I don't know. This was a Jess one. Jess was really into the Field Museum because we had like our plans were to go on the to Lake Michigan on a boat. The last day we were there. However, because the Hurricane Beryl remnants came through Chicago that night, like the water was really choppy and we had to cancel our plans. So actually the White Sox game was our backup, but if we couldn't do the White Sox game because of weather, we were going to go to the Field Museum. So, but one of the really cool things that we did is we went to the Hampton House, which is the childhood home of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther who was assassinated by the FBI. His childhood home is now run by the Black Panther Cubs, who are like a wing of the Black Panthers, obviously, that kind of carry out his more like community-driven efforts of running food pantries and like community events and things like that. And they actually, our tour guide was Comrade Cool, is how she was introduced. And she's like one of the ones that helps run it. And basically it used to be kind of a drug house, like a flop house that the city was just more than willing to like leave and let go. And they had this long fight to actually get it back in control of the Black Panther Cubs and all that, which they did in like 2018 and had to renovate. And basically it is a museum, but it's kind of just a loose collection of shit, like just like kind of in the because there's not a whole, I mean, he died at 21, so there's not like a whole lot of stuff, and a lot of it's like art and newspaper clippings. There was a really cool painting's not the right word because it was made from cloth, but like a cloth mosaic that I think she said someone in Nigeria had made that was all like that, a mosaic of Fred Hampton. She took us to the Fred Hampton pool in the like community center, which is they're fighting with Chicago because after they got hit with an ice storm several years ago, the city, I didn't press too much because it seemed like a sore subject, like an active fight that they were having. The city declared the pool unfit and refused to reopen it. So they've been like fighting with them for a few years to try to get it reopened because it is a really nice like community area and all this. But it was just really cool, and it's nice to hear because she did not pull any punches about like Chicago administration and basically said like Lori Lightfoot did nothing to help them at all. But since Brandon Johnson has been mayor, they've had some momentum on reopening a lot of these initiatives and things like that. But it was really cool. It was really fun.
It's awesome. I think even if it's in some ways it not being a highly formalized museum, provides an opportunity to create a community.
Yeah, for sure. And that seems to be more of what the initiative is for that anyways, because we got there and like we got there a little bit early because it's just a house in a neighborhood. That's all it is. And our tour guide like pulled up and like unlocked, so it was clearly like it's not a place that people are at. Like she came because we made reservations, and almost looked a little surprised when like she got out of the car like, oh, we got somebody coming today. So I don't think it's like that's not the big like that's not the main push of what they're trying to do. A lot of it is the community organizing in this. It's the village of Maywood, which is like a little town right outside of like Chicago proper. But it was cool.
Hell yeah,
it's fun.
Yeah, I love the city of Chicago. I think it is.
I really, really liked it too.
A big city that maintains some Midwestern characteristics. It doesn't feel quite as like cold or I mean not.
Well, I went in summer, so yeah.
But cold and like alienating.
Yeah,
as
it has personality. Yeah, even if they don't know how to eat their fucking food in this city.
And lots of small ethnic neighborhoods that have retained their character. It's a cool place.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. What about you? What you been getting into lately?
Well, I have also not been consuming things at quite the clip that I have for the last month. Been moving and setting up our new house, but
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very, very excited. Many goofy things to come in the future.
Hell yeah.
But I have in the last couple of days, well, in the last week or so, watched 2 different movies that are from or about plays.
Okay.
So I was like, that's kind of an interesting theme. So I wanted to talk about those. So the first is I watched Marat Sade, or sometimes stylized as Marat/Sade, referring to the second referring to Marquis de Sade. And I'm going to pull up real quick on Letterboxd because the actual title of this is like much longer and I didn't write it in here.
Unexpected Virtue of Ignorant or whatever.
Right, like Birdman.
I was trying to think of another movie about plays.
The persecution and assassination of Jean-Paul Marat as performed by the inmates of the asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade.
Okay.
From 1967.
Better, I think they went with a little bit
punchier
of a title.
Marat/Sade. And I'd like to shout out to, I think sometimes listener and also friend and also person who will be playing in the show next Saturday, Joe, for helping me gain access to it because this has been on my watch list for a long time and I've really wanted to see it. It featured a few familiar faces to me, including the guy who plays Marquis de Sade is the same dude who plays the Chevalier in Barry Lyndon. And then also Glenda Jackson is in it, and she was also starred in Women in Love, a Ken Russell movie I talked about a couple of episodes ago that I recently watched. It is really highly formalistic. It is like people who are incarcerated in a mental asylum putting on a play about Marat and basically the French Revolution as a whole and like his role in it, to an unseen audience implied to be of bourgeois people.
Okay.
While the Marquis de Sade, who's also imprisoned in this asylum, is like directing it, but also engaged in this dialogic like antagonism with Marat.
Okay.
It's very talky. It all takes place on a stage that is contained behind like barricades.
Okay. It sounds a little bit like Buñuel, like surrealism, like that breaking, like the Discreet Charm and the other ones that are kind of like
very
addressing the audience, but not
not dissimilar, except this is like quite literally like staged. Like they are on stage.
A stage, yeah.
But the stage is a room inside of an asylum, so it's all like white tile.
Okay.
And then sometimes there are these zoomed out shots where the audience is like totally cast in shadows. You cannot see them beyond some silhouetting. And then there's like, not a barricade. Not a fence. What am I like? not gates. What's it called? A
Like
cage, like a cage,
yeah.
basically. And then behind that is this white-walled,
Okay.
tiled room, very classic, 17th century asylum.
Yeah.
And I found it. I am talking to the back of the microphone, so hopefully that was captured. But I found it to be like, I love it. That is the kind of shit that I love, and it's very explicit engagement with theory. Like, they are engaged in these conversations and arguments about like the role of individual action versus collective action, right? Like, Saad was not a socialist. He was very much oriented towards the individual's will, the individual's spirit and liberty, right? Like, literally being a libertine, versus Marat making arguments about the people and the will of the people. And so it's also very much about the nature of social change and kind of the role of thinkers versus the role of the people, and how violence is controllable, or maybe it's not, in terms of using violence for political ends. So it was dope. I don't know if anyone listening to this would
That sounds
like
cool.
the things that I just talked about, but it is definitely, if you are cool with it, there is no naturalism, right? It's not like, oh, people in their environment and their feelings. Like, that is not what is happening here. It is a series of theoretical arguments that takes place in an asylum. Then the other movie that I watched, maybe movie or not, debatable, that is from or about a play, is I watched Slave Play, not a movie, a play, which just dropped on HBO Max. Yes, those are 3 sentences. It came out this year. Are you familiar with Slave Play? This is
I am not. About? No, okay. I'm not. But I was seeing the Jeremy Harris sounds familiar.
Harris. I've talked about him before. He was he's a playwright and writer, and he was in, when I talked about The Sweet East a couple of episodes ago, yes. He is in that as an actor, which is not usually kind of his presence in pulp culture thus far, but he is pretty, like, think around our age, honestly, maybe even just slightly younger, not a lot. I believe he's in his 30s, but
35.
Okay, so kind of right around our respective ages. And he Slave Play played off Broadway, then it went on Broadway in the last like 5 years. I want to say like maybe just after like 2020. I think what's shown in the movie is that he was workshopping it originally in 2019, and it is a movie is a play about race, sex, racialized sexual violence, and many other combinations of those two words. The movie is basically, it shows him preparing. There are parts of it that are preparing for the original run and then the Broadway run, but most of it is him restaging scenes from the play with several different actors playing the same character, and then him talking through how he wrote the dialogue, what changed in various iterations, and you watch him direct the people. It is very much a movie that is about theater, as a specific kind of art form, and what is lost by trying to convert it into
but you're
a
still
movie.
Watching the narrative as well,
a lot of it. It's not continuous. Like, it's not like, oh, you're seeing the play being performed from top to bottom. Yeah. It's like
punctuated with
you'll see like major scenes basically from each act, things like that. But I think in some ways, like, he can be a little controversial, but I think Jeremy O. Harris, like, is a genius. I think that he has this kind of like impish mage, Jester King, thumb-biting soothsayer kind of vibe that I really fuck with. Yeah, he does have a great fashion sense.
Google Images, he's got a dope look.
Yeah, and I was thinking a lot about this because the not just himself, but the play was very controversial because of what's depicted within it. And I'm going to avoid, out of respect for his approach to his own work, not say what the plot it is. But he can be pretty, he and his work can be pretty controversial. it had me thinking about like, why does transgressive art like appeal to me? And I think I really love transgressive art that acknowledge and not just acknowledges, but really pursues the fact that the act of transgression, of of pushing past the boundaries of normative, agreed upon good sense and or good taste, can be really productively disruptive. By which I mean something that jolts the viewer out of their comfort zone and out of their usual way of thinking or doing things, creates new possibilities, novel thought patterns, emergent relations, or ways of relating within existing ones. And I think that like Harris shocks in this very specific way with the intention of sticking a pickaxe into the eye of those who've become overly comfortable with racial domination while acting as if they are liberated from it. And the ways like in the movie he talks about how one of the things that inspired him was how like the dominance of he refers to it as EDI, DEI, whatever, how DEI consultants like come in, stir up shit, and don't like actually change anything systematically. And not that there's no value in having vocabulary and things brought to people's attention, but
the necessary changes aren't made, then it doesn't really
or and
addressed.
I will also say as a sidebar that there's some like sociological work that shows that it actually makes things worse because it makes stereotypes salient in people's minds without replacing the power relations. But I just thought when he was talking about this in the movie, I was like, that makes a lot of sense in terms of what you see happening on screen, in terms of the analogy that he's drawing. I'm also super partial to art. I've talked about before. I love art about artists. I love movies about movies. And I'm partial to art that peeks into the behind the scenes processes, which this movie has in spades. Like that's really what this movie is about. He breaks down how his dialogue evolved over time, like sometimes what he initially wrote versus like how it was performed, or versus what he had to add because people weren't understanding what he intended to convey. How different actors put forth different performances that generate different meanings within the context of the scenes. The tension between his motivations and preferences, and how sometimes they're at odds with the needs of the audience for kind of like explicit and transparent communication. How he kind of like doesn't want to do that, but also has to acknowledge that if you're putting something on stage, like people have to understand it independent of you explaining it to them. Really fucking cool shit. And it's like 82 minutes, I think.
Love that.
So it's definitely worth watching.
That was making me think. I'm trying to think because like I feel like I've seen a couple movies that I really like that are like meta plays, like you're watching a play but with some fourth wall breaking. I was trying to think if there's any other ones that you can think of off the top of your head. The one that I was thinking of is there's a movie, I might even have it in here. I think it's classified as a documentary, but there was a movie called Caesar Must Die, I think was the name of it, which was
it's pretty ape-phobic.
Which was a movie about about an Italian prison where the prisoners were putting on a play of Julius Caesar.
Whoa!
But if
this sounds like extremely my shit.
I might have it. I'm gonna take a break from the mic while I yell to see if I have it. Shit. I don't see it, but it's if I remember correctly, I think like most of it, like some of it's on a stage, but some of it is filmed like in the prison as if like the prisoners themselves are the characters, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to me. Like the plays. Not plays that adapted into movies that are plays with some sort of like meta or fourth wall like commentary or whatever.
Yeah, I obviously, as I just talked about with Marat / Sod, I definitely like that. I also am just like interested in, and I think it's more clearly expressed or more easily expresses itself in documentary of artists like just showing their process. So I have if you follow me on Letterboxd, I have a tag on Letterboxd called Artistes on Film, except I mistyped it one time when I entered it, and so it's Artistes on Films.
Artistes on Film.
Accidentally made it plural.
I like it.
But what I have in that category right now is Crumb, classic.
Oh yeah,
classic doc. Caravaggio.
I've not seen that.
So great. Directed by Derek Jarman, who, I mean, made many great things, but was also the production designer for my favorite movie of all time, The Devils.
Hell yeah.
Varda by Agnes, right? Great example. Flux Gourmet, which is not about a real artist, that's fiction, but
That's narrative. Is that narrative? Yeah.
It's fiction. It's Peter Strickland's most recent movie, the guy who did In Fabric and The Duke of Burgundy. Another one of my favorite guys. Like The Ballad of Genesis and Lady Jane, Black Art in the Absence of Light. I got a Steely Dan documentary in here. I got the Little Richard story. I've got Woman House, which if you're interested in feminist art, I really, really highly recommend. And then I think the thing that is most closely analogous to this, which I've seen 3 or 4 times, each time I've borrowed it from Cap City. I don't know that you can stream this anywhere, to be honest. But it's called Narcissister Organ Player. And it's a performance artist who wears like a blow up doll-esque mask on her face. And the movie is showing her performance art, but also she talks about her process, but you never see her outside of the mask. And I would say that this and Slave Play, not a movie, a play, are pretty similar in that they show you the person's art, like they are foregrounding the person's art and reflect on their processes, while also like not really taking you backstage. Like there's still kind of, to use a wrestling term, like kayfabe. It's ultimately a performance, and so the piece itself is the play, right? It's a performance art.
I will say also, I always put our Letterboxd in the episode descriptions, so follow us on there, and I'll add a link to your list of artistes on films. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up, sorry, no, I wrote a lot for all of this. Obviously, I was like fucking going off this week. Didn't have the energy to do anything except type in this Google Doc, apparently. I needed you to carry me because I was traveling all week and I feel unprepared.
So I found while trying to dig into another Twitter battle, which I will not recount here, but was the journey. I found this really dope ass website about works of art that have been destroyed through human action or inaction. Called Archive of Destruction. I'd never seen this before. It was really cool. And the thing that I was initially looking for was not at all related to this, but through looking through the website, I found that there's a particular entry that's kind of a flashback to our episode on the Battle of Algiers, about a work of art called Enclosed. I didn't like what is contained within and what I'm about to describe. I had never heard of before, and it's like really fascinating to me. So in 1928, Paul Landowski, who's a sculptor, was commissioned by the French colonial government to build a massive statue showing European and Arabic men and women like leaning on each other near a horse while holding up a coffin. That was intended, like in Algeria, that was intending to memorialize the French and the Algerians who died in World War I. But many Algerians felt that it was more a looming symbol of imperial domination than like a celebration of like the lives of people who died in World War I. So, in 1978, Mohammed Isiakrem, in preparation for the Pan-African Games being hosted in Algeria, covered it and turned it into this like blocky, brutalistic style monolith that has hands busting out of manacles, like chains. And like when I say covered it, I mean like put like, I don't know the material, but like cement or something literally on top of over it, this statue. And then in a moment of truth that is so heavy with metaphor, it's no surprise that the damn thing broke. In 2020, the public work of art started to crack and the faces of the original sculpture were like peeking out and being exposed again. So
That's
then
awesome.
Algerian artist Amina Mania created an installation referring to the resulting piece as a double monument to like the French-Algerian colonial relationship. This whole website is really dope. I love art. I love public art. And I love that it can't stay the same And here its evolution is like such rich symbolism for its underlying meaning. Fucking crazy.
That sounds really cool. And it was called
dope.
Archives of Destruction.
Archive of Destruction.
Hell yeah. That does sound cool. I'm going to check that out. Well, let us move into current events. I kind of covered mine a little bit with what was going on with me in Chicago. Seeing that immaculate inning was pretty cool that had me celebrating. But what's either got you celebrating or living in despair?
Well, I'm also going to keep it pretty brief here, but I wanted to draw attention to the fact that Ryan Graham and Jeremy Scahill of the Intercept, like journalists who are most commonly associated with the Intercept, have created a new independent journalism outlet called Dropsite News. Oop, I'm going to sneeze.
I'm going to censor it for us. Achoo. Achoo.
Thank you.
Trying to drown it out on the mic. That's a keeper.
Gosh darn, you know what I didn't take before coming here? An allergy pill.
I have a lot of cats, so I'll apologize. I don't have a lot. I have 2, but they create a lot of dander.
It's my own fault. I can be responsible for my own senses.
I have some. Do you want to?
It'll be fine.
Pause for a Zyrtec break.
I think like a little more coffee will.
All right.
Will purge it, But so they create a new independent journalist outlet called Dropsite News. And one of the first articles they published is a fucking absolute heater.
Yep. Called
On the Record with Hamas.
I had read about half of it this morning and haven't finished it yet, but I will.
When I saw, popped up in my email, like, On Record with Hamas, I was like, well, I gotta read that.
Yeah.
And I don't really have like a neatly packaged conclusion here. Usually I try and have like that meta-analysis, that step back takeaway. Just fucking read it is like why I'm bringing it up, is that I really encourage you to read it. And I just wanted to say that I respect journalism that treats all parties involved in significant newsmaking conflicts as worthy of inquiry.
Right. Yeah.
That has a curiosity about causes and effects, strategy, and refuses to totally otherize, Hamas, or like insert your other stand-in classic like capital ETM enemy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how can you understand something if you won't actually examine it? I'd venture that to guess that answer is they don't endeavor to understand, but we can be better than that. I think there's also something really interesting here that also kind of relates to what we're going to talk about in a little bit, about how resistance movements are viewed at different points in time. An idea, again, worth keeping central in our mind as we chew on Che, perhaps, about how civilian death and the disruption of power bears out immediately versus in the long term, and how, especially in struggles for national liberation specifically, costs may be paid by different individuals than those who reap their benefits, meaning like generationally, right? Like they're the people who may die in the pursuit of freedom may not obviously are doing so on behalf of sometimes a different group, a different community, a broader community, a different generation than the folks that may ultimately get to reap the fruits of those sacrifices. And I think if you care about this fight, you should read this article because it takes Hamas seriously, by which I don't mean like, yay, Hamas.
Yes,
necessarily.
It's nuanced and
and just also like we have to engage it. Like, what is the benefit on any level to resolving any conflict of like throwing a black tarp over half or more of the participants? Like,
because so much of the coverage of Hamas begins and ends on October 7th and doesn't really care about the nuances before that, the history of it and all that. And I think, that's really important to...
And I think in terms of something that I think is really important in social movements, which and revolutionary movements and national liberation movements, which does pop up with Che, is with Che, Jesus Christ, I'm losing my mind. Is that like narrative is important, right? Like people having their own, it really matters on every level. It matters in terms of like what bystanders and your enemy, how they narrativize you and your struggle, or your, by you, I mean like the group's struggle. It also matters a lot to keep people motivated, right? Like they have to have an internal narrative of like, what are we doing? It's not disparate, separate actions. It's part of an arc of history. People, leftists say this all the time, right? Like the arc of history bends towards towards justice, paraphrasing Martin Luther King. And I think that having that sense of arc matters. And I think that something that is very interesting about refusing to engage or interrogate Hamas's behavior in their history is denying them any sense of arc, right? Denying them any sense of narrative. And I think as leftists, like, we should push against that. It doesn't mean you have to fucking agree with them. But I think you should strive to understand how, like, the chain analysis of how behaviors are linked to each other.
For sure.
So I just wanted to raise that.
Hell yeah. Well, with that, let us get into our movie talk. We are watching the second of Steven Soderberg's Che movies. I just did it too. So in our last episode, we discussed Steven Soderberg's Che Part 1, which showed the revolutionary actions of Ernesto Che Guevara as he fought alongside Fidel and Raul Castro for Cuban independence from capitalist forces. Soderberg's Che Part 2 is a bit of a tonal switch from Part 1. Whereas Part 1 was more dedicated to Che's philosophies of revolution, Part 2 is a full immersion into the actions of a guerrilla revolutionary. Part 2 also changes locations to Bolivia, where in 1966, like Cuba in 1958, it was in the midst of a revolutionary uprising against Bolivia's military junta, which sought to uphold the status quo of global capitalism. But let's back up and add some context to the nearly 10-year gap between Che Part 1 and Part 2. Following the Cuban Revolution, Ernesto Che Guevara became a folk hero to Cuba, and Fidel Castro named him to several government positions, including the Minister of Finance. By 1964, Che had become a statesman and a figurehead for capitalist resistance, which we see in Che Part 1 in those flash forwards where he's attending the UN delegation in 1964. But Che knew he was made for revolution, not governance. So his revolutionary interest focused on Africa, specifically the Congo. It was in the Congo that Che again solidified his reputation as a guerrilla revolutionary. In 1960, the Congo had officially gained its independence from Belgium, who had ruled over the country for most of the 20th century. After this independence was gained, a power vacuum was created, sending the Congo into crisis and basically launching a proxy war between the United States and the USSR. There's a lot of really complicated global political stuff happening here, so for the sake of time, condensed version without a lot of nuance, the US and Western countries were worried that the Congo would fall to Soviet influence. The main faction of rebels, known as Simbas, were backed by the USSR and China. The Simbas wanted to establish a Congo that adhered to more Maoist principles, and naturally, the US opposed this, supporting the opposition, a much more ethnic nationalist faction. By 1965, Che Guevara had gone to the Congo under a pseudonym to advise the Simbas in guerrilla tactics. Eventually, the Simbas were quelled, but Che wasn't done spreading revolution because another struggle had been brewing back home in South America. Bolivia in the 60s, as I said, looked a lot like Cuba in the 50s, ruled by military dictatorship that was completely deferential to global capitalism. In a 1964 coup, the Bolivian army had recently overthrown Victor Paz Estenssoro, a third-term president and leader of the nationalist revolutionary movement that instigated the previous revolution in 1952. Which was successful, but less radical as it ushered a rising class of petit bourgeois. In 1967, disguised as a middle-aged businessman, Guevara snuck into Bolivia to lead a small band of rebels against the controlling Bolivian army. And though the Bolivian insurgency looked a lot like the Cuban Revolution, Che met struggles in Bolivia that he did not in Cuba. Che knew that true revolution only existed if he had the support of the working class, the farmers, peasants, and proletariat. But this was something the Bolivian army knew as well. Where Che and Fidel were able to capture the hearts and minds of the Cuban peasantry, Guevara was unable to do so with the Bolivian peasantry, which had already been exposed to anti-rebellion propaganda from the Bolivian army. Che Part 2, also directed by Steven Soderberg, explores the grueling nature of guerrilla warfare. And while Che Part 1 shows us the success of guerrilla warfare in the Cuban Revolution, Part 2 shows us the shortcomings of guerrilla warfare in the Bolivian insurgency and ultimately the end of Ernesto Che Guevara's revolutionary life. So let us start with just our first impressions of the movie. What did you think of Che Part 2? I know we both really, really liked Che Part 1. Where'd you land on Part 2?
I think he should have made one movie that was 3 hours long.
One movie that, yeah. Well, I think we discussed it briefly, but I think it'll be interesting to revisit the original concept of the movie, which was when it was originally supposed to be a Terrence Malick movie, it was just going to focus on Bolivia.
Yeah, that makes a lot of... Terrence Malick making this movie specifically, like his iteration of what is shown on film for Part 2, that makes a lot of sense because he loves pensive, sweeping, slow moving
languid, just like yeah,
sitting with things and being present in the natural environment and tying that in with what's happening with the humans that he's inspecting. I didn't love this, and not in the sense that I thought it was bad or faulty, but I don't tend to love movies where people are sitting around for long periods of time without speaking, and I tend to like movies that are dialogue heavy, and when I don't, or when I like movies that are not dialogue heavy, it's usually something that's more like Che Part 1, where there is still action, there's some propulsion driving things forward, but people aren't talking about it. I'm fine with that. This, I felt like, could have been clipped into 45 minutes and appended to the end of Part 1.
Yeah.
What about you?
I like this one a lot still. Not as much as Part 1. I think that this one is more like frustrating and aggravating, because I think maybe a theme of this one is more like languishing in like futility and not finding that momentum that they found in Cuba. So like, I think this one more, Soderberg is more interested in like immersion of it, which I think is going to feel boring, for lack of a better word, but that's not necessarily what I mean. I don't mean that I found the movie boring as much as I think you are getting that feeling of being stuck, being like, the
discomfort is part of the point. For sure.
Yeah, but it doesn't make it as compelling of like an action piece as maybe the first one was. Although I think there are some really cool like sequences and stuff. I really like the capture sequence at the end. Just like stylistically, the choices, which we talk about the stylist too, because I'm sure you noticed from Part 1 and Part 2 that Part 2 is almost all handheld, like really shaky, choppy, which I think serves it pretty well in that like tonal switch as well. Did you like that aspect of it, the handheld? I mean,
like we talked about for the first episode, those are some of the portions that I really liked a lot. I mean, I enjoyed the movie as a whole, but it's one of the approaches because it did feel immersive. I do think it adds to a little bit of confusion for me, which I think is part of the point. When the group gets divided, like about halfway through Part 2 or so, and they start kind of increasingly are segmented to try and get food or get other supplies, and people are injured, that dynamic of the groups separating plus the handheld shaky cam just makes it so I'm like, I don't even know who I'm like looking at. I mean, I know who Benicio del Toro is, but otherwise I'm kind of like, where are we?
And
I
think
it's hard to situate myself a little with it.
And Soderberg also said that like he wanted to make them as counterparts, which I think because the breakout of the groups and how they handled it is not that different from the Cuban Revolution. They had like 3 primary columns that kind of moved as one, and then when we see that the Bolivian Revolution doesn't work as well, that's when we start to see the columns like break apart and kind of not working as well.
Right, it's a fragment instead of a faction.
But yeah, I like that a lot, and I will just say, like, I mean, Benicio del Toro is great, but he's really, really fucking good in both of these movies. I guess we can jump towards the end if you don't mind. Just the part the where he gets captured. I mean, the plot in this movie is fairly thin. He's gonna go to Bolivia. The revolution is not going to work that well. We'll get into it. And he's captured and ultimately executed. The capture sequence where like he gets desperate and is just kind of like running and shooting. And I think like his physicality in that is so fucking good. He's also like, as we talked about, Che was asthmatic, and it's getting like...
I was going to say, I feel like it contrasts really well against what we see that opening scene in Part 1. Not that like opening scene to the whole movie, but the opening scene of him in the forest or in the jungle, where he is out of breath, trying to be really quiet while like lumbering through
right and kind of doing okay at it,
but like the contrast
of this, just like
where the context shifts and suddenly he is exposed.
Those things become like, in Part 1 it was like a little a character choice that like he persevered, and now it's like you're feeling the weight of
Well,
these.
it's almost
like,
like okay, he would straight up be the Ubermensch if he didn't have
Right,
some
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of
yeah,
you
he
know?
needed some sort of a
Like, I'm not saying-
kryptonite or whatever. Yeah.
So I'm not saying like asthma is a weakness, but you know what I mean in terms of like that is not an asset
Yeah.
in a space where you don't have consistent access to medical care.
Yeah.
Right. And your medications, which but the vulnerability of it for the movement and for his own safety is dramatically different
yeah.
when the context shifts.
Yeah, and his performance is so goddamn good in all of this. What's your favorite Benicio movie performance? I just thought of this now, so I didn't put a lot of thought in it. But it might be this for me.
Yeah, I think in terms of feeling like his performance is really central, and also like because I mean, I know this is like maybe a little fraught because I know obviously Johnny Depp sucks. I'm not saying whatever. Hunter S. Thompson is much beloved in our household and was important for our respective political developments, even if not everything is perfect, right? And Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I love Terry Gilliam. I've talked about Brazil is one of my favorite movies. We love that movie. His performance in that is bonkers, but I can't like him, which makes it hard to, I don't know, to fully elevate.
I like when
it.
he's a weirdo. He's like he's a good weirdo and stuff.
He is a good weirdo, but also that Dr. Gonzo is just awful. Especially the second half of that movie. He says heinous things, so it's hard to be like, that's my favorite. So I think but it is really bombastic, and he goes all in. He does not hold back. Yeah. And honestly, I think he's one of the best parts of Traffic. Which we,
for sure. And Sicario.
Talked about before.
Yeah. The one that I think of, which is probably a bad movie, I haven't revisited in a while, but it's a lesser Friedkin movie. But I saw it as like a 14 or 15-year-old when I was first like really getting into movies, and like I knew like I didn't see a lot of Benicio del Toro, but I knew like he's an actor. But it was a movie with him and Tommy Lee Jones called The Hunted. I feel like actually
that does sound like a movie that Tommy Lee Jones would be in.
I started talking shit on this a little bit there, but I think this movie probably holds up. It's like a The Hunted. So Tommy Lee Jones is like a special forces guy that trains like the most elite of the elite to be killers and live off the land. And Benicio del Toro plays one of his pupils who has gone like who's disillusioned and he's basically like doing a Rambo. He's like in the woods like killing people, and the only one who can catch him is old ass Tommy Lee Jones because he's the one that taught him. So they're like Ramboing each other in the wood, like setting like little traps and shit. I feel like it's pretty fun. I haven't seen it in a while, but I feel like it's.
I mean, that is definitely one of those types of movies that is a Saturday afternoon on the couch watch in our household, where it's just like, it doesn't matter, And if they can be sprinkled, if there are people that are solid performers that are sprinkled in, that's really the best you can ask for. But he really does have a career that is like, I mean, he's got these standout lead performances. But so much of the strength of his career is just doing funky, interesting character work, and even doing that sprinkled throughout, even after he's had these standout solo moments, like I'm looking at him like, oh yeah, Basquiat. He's like,
oh, I never saw that one. I need to see that. That's with old boy. What's the actor's name?
Jeremy Wright.
Jeremy Wright. Yeah.
I don't know why old boy.
I don't know either. I was just trying to think of it. Actually, I have a funny.
Jeremy Wright plays.
Every time I think of Jeremy Wright, I think of this.
Not Jeremy Wright. Jeffrey Wright.
Jeffrey
Jesus
Wright.
Christ,
Yes,
sorry.
yes.
Jeffrey Wright.
I once heard a comedian say that they think Jeffrey Wright wrote his own IMDb page, and that's all I think about every single time I see it. It's just very like effusive and like.
He is like I think like a K-Hive guy, like prior to the coconut pilling of current days, and is known for I think being a little obnoxious, overly liberal. But I love him as an actor.
Yeah, he's great.
And Basquiat is a great fucking movie, and he also Benicio del Toro plays like a junkie art friend, in that we talked about Traffic and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He's good in 21 Grams, which is not that great of a movie. He's great in Sin City, which I have seen. That's one of those movies that for me, he's like a cop.
Oh yeah.
Or maybe PI.
He's the one that's like chasing Elijah Wood's character, right?
Yeah, he that is one of those movies I've talked about before on here. I always basically have one directed by a man, hyper violent movie that is my like middle of the night watch, or like I'm falling asleep. And Scorsese has oftentimes occupied that role, but there was a period in high school and like very early college where Sin City was
That's a good one. It's fun. It's fun. It's goofy, fun, it's silly.
It has, also there's like
heavy shit in it too.
Like
yeah. But I mean, like, it's just so stylized that it's like you can throw it on. You can pop at any point in the movie and be like, okay, I'm down with this.
Like Savage's Inherent Vice.
Yeah, I was also forgetting like how much big blockbuster shit he's been in. Most that I don't know if I like that much. I'm specifically talking about the Marvel shit, but he is really weird in that, in like a way that he's like I don't remember what his fucking character's called, but he's like he's in Guardians of the Galaxy where he's like the fence, selling like weird goods. Yeah. Which I don't like. I don't know if I haven't seen those movies in forever, but I just remember him being really strange and like interesting in it, and in Star Wars too.
And Star Wars, and then did you see The French Dispatch?
I have not seen The French Dispatch.
I quite liked it.
Is that the first time he's been in a Wes Anderson movie?
I think so.
The And Only?
I believe so. Yeah. I was not the most recent Asteroid City was a little. That is something that includes a play that's about what's going on in the plot, but I found it to be a little emotionally cold for me. I think people critique him that way in general, and I don't necessarily feel that way, but
I have that.
I didn't feel. I had a hard time like clicking into it, but I loved The French Dispatch.
Okay, those are the two I haven't seen. The most
and
recent.
He's good in it. And speaking of Jeffrey Wright, the whole third, like, is it triptych? Whatever. There's a section that is like entirely Jeffrey Wright, basically.
Oh, cool.
He's amazing in. And also apparently Benicio del Toro is going to be in the upcoming Paul Thomas Anderson film that doesn't have a name yet. So I will absolutely be seated for that. One thing I take away is he's a good actor.
Yeah, we love Benicio.
Good actor.
But yeah, so going through the movie's plot, let's the other structural change for the movie that's a little bit different is this one is structured by like days in Bolivia. So like you get the running count, which I think ended up being just shy of a year. But so we see the first 100 days, and it's within the first 100 days where we start to see where things are going to kind of perk up, that are going to start to fester and become maybe the reason that it wasn't successful. So let's talk about a little bit what we see in the first few. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I know you want to discuss some of them more intricately when we kind of go through the plot. But the big one is that we see he does not have the solidarity with the peasant class that they did in Cuba. We see that the Bolivian army has kind of already reached the peasantry first with propaganda and kind of convincing them that the revolutionaries don't have their best interest in mind. He also doesn't have the support of his political party.
Yes, the Communist Party. The leader of the Communist Party is like...
He says the conditions are not right for this kind of revolution. Played by... I forgot his name again. I said it in the last one. The Stand and Deliver guy. God.
Oh.
Jesus Christ. Lou Diamond Phillips.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple weird cameos in this movie.
True.
Yeah, Lou Diamond Phillips plays Mario Monde, I believe.
It's Monge. It's Monje.
Monje. Yeah, okay, yeah. Mario Monje. Yeah, who is the leader of the Communist Party who basically meets with Che. They seem to have somewhat of a like jovial relationship, but essentially tells him, yeah, we're not going to do too much to support in this.
There's something really interesting there, which I was also, I didn't include this in the section that we'll talk about later of comparing Cuba and Bolivia more explicitly. But I'll raise it here because we hear a little bit about this in the movie. And it is much more evident if you look at like the historical text that the reason why the Bolivian Communist Party did not support Che is because, and the revolutionaries, other revolutionaries, is because the Soviets did not want them to and did not want this to happen. That was also true in Cuba, so I didn't include it as a comparison because it's not relevant in terms of the differential outcomes. Yeah. Or at least it's not the major explanatory factor. But this is something I would love to dig into in a future episode. It is adjacent to my interest in the Soviet Sino split, like the Chinese Communist
Right,
Party,
yeah.
And the Soviets, because they're a nation state, are ultimately not so ideologically pure that they're interested in communism, advancing a socialist and communistic agenda everywhere in the world.
Right.
They still ultimately care about how they're embedded within global relations, and essentially it's a little more complex than this, but essentially didn't want to piss off the United States,
Right.
and start a fight with the US over what they considered to be like high risk, low reward
Yeah. And actually, I
like
think
revolution.
and Che had already been exposed to that in the Congo, I believe, because I've been doing a little bit of I got this cool book in Chicago at this really cool bookstore, but it's called I Embrace You with All My Revolutionary Fervor, and it's letters that Che Guevara wrote from 1947 to 1967. So I haven't been able to read the whole thing, but I flash forward to some of the moments in Bolivia and the Congo, and he expressed a lot of frustration with the leader of the rebels in the Congo. And I think again, I don't want to shoot off in the mouth because I barely have touched this book, but I believe a lot of the frustration was he did not see them as interested in the Revolutionary Act as he did as they were like a piece in the USSR's like chess game, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and like again, the same thing was again not exact. I shouldn't say the same, not exactly the same, but a similar dynamic was at play with the Cuban Revolution too, where the Soviets were like, please don't stir up shit 90 miles south of our biggest global enemy.
Yeah.
You
But
know?
I guess the difference would be that what would the difference be? I guess why
I just think there was like the more local factors, the conditions on the ground in the respective countries were pretty significantly different, which we'll dive into in a little, that I think mattered more. I think it's possible that Soviet intervention could have been the deciding factor, right? If they did have additional resources, support, munitions, food, medicine, etc. But in the absence of the Soviets playing an active role in either revolution, then it was kind of left to the circumstances on the ground to be the deciding factors, would be my read on it.
Yeah. And I guess also the exposure from the Cuban Revolution made it more I guess, well, this will segue into it's something that we left off, is that Che became like a known quantity after Cuba.
I do write about this.
Yeah. He became a known quantity after Cuba, and maybe there was more there's definitely more emphasis on like squashing that before it could really get off the ground on both sides, I think.
And that relates, I'm going to just segue into me talking about being a foreigner for a second here, is because I do think that matters, right? Like Che.
It's all right.
I cannot.
Well, that's okay, because when you talked about that one movie, Marat Sade, I was going to say Sade. So that I'm glad you spoke on it first.
Yeah, Marquis de Sade, not the illustrious, beautiful voice like velvet R&B singer Sade.
Do you know anytime Sade comes up, I have one line that I say, and I don't know if anyone will know, but I say, "That was Liz's." Do you know what that's from?
I do not.
It's from Shaun of the Dead, when they're picking what records to throw at the zombies, and they're like,
it was a Sade record.
Yeah, and the one that they, I think, throw is Prince's Batman soundtrack. He's like, throw it.
Get rid of it. But, thinking about Che's role and how the peasants weren't supporting him and stuff, one of the things that they say repeatedly is, and it kind of seems to come up organically, and also it's part of the propaganda that the Bolivian army is spreading against him, is focusing on him as a foreigner, and that he is someone that has a reputation already that is independent of like the revolutionary spirit. And there's a lot of stuff going on there, but something that I wanted to bring up that I was thinking about while watching the movie is that how there's this really interesting tension between nationalism, which is really compelling. We know that like the Cubans, we see it in the movie, and also right, again, it's true historically, that nationalism was a really compelling factor for the Cuban revolutionaries and the people who ultimately ended up joining them. The idea of like, we have to defend Cuba against the United States imperialism, economic and otherwise, right? This sense of nationalism, major motivator, versus a Marxist-Leninist, almost humanistic, or at least emphasizing humanity and a revolutionary spirit in and of itself approach that Che embodied, and that these things are can work together in kind of a tentative, like, handshake way, but also are ultimately in tension with each other. And that's one of the things that we see, is that when they're able to push, the Bolivian army and the US are able to push this narrative of he's a foreigner, that the spirit of nationalism is more important than the proletariat,
right?
Spirit of revolution.
Yeah, and we see that poison kind of the guerrillas as well, because there's a lot of tension, because he brings in a like faction of Cuban guerrillas that don't get along or listen to or work well with the Bolivian insurgents as well. And yeah, so we see that, like, that idea of a foreigner kind of play in that way as well.
And it seems just in general, we see, like I said, lack of discipline among the
Yeah.
guerrillas.
Stealing the food and eating it. Whereas I feel like in part one, there's a lot of emphasis put on like them working as a community and as a group, but like they wouldn't have done something like that or to that extent. Because I think what do we see them like stealing and drinking a bunch of condensed milk or something?
Yeah, I think it was, at minimum, it was canned milk, which like it could just be shelf stable milk.
Right,
but yes, and they're one of them's hiding one of them, you know, and they're arguing about whether or not it's permissible to do this
and who should listen to who and all that. So yeah, that's kind of the first 100 days where we start to see the cracks. Then we start to see some these big critical strategic errors. First off, we see that Tanya, who is I don't know if I'm saying that, Tanya, who is in the first one, I believe, in a smaller role, but I believe she's side by side with him in the shootout at the end of the first one. But she led one of the columns in Bolivia, and we see that one of their spots gets basically ambushed. They capture a lot of their supplies and information. And then the big one that we spend some time...
Get shot.
Yeah, and people
during
get
it.
shot. And then we get a little hint at what America is doing, the American intervention, which is essentially... we see at a press conference the Bolivian president basically say they're only giving us helicopters and planes. And then we see that, no, they're training them, they're advising them, they're giving them like outlined strategies. And the one that I really like was when the American diplomats are meeting, basically he says there's 3 things that you need to address, which are the actions of the guerrillas themselves, the lack of guerrilla capability at all levels, and various elements of the population becoming indifferent to the situations. And he says Guevara is irrelevant if you are controlling the hearts and minds of the peasants. So essentially they are the ones that outline the strategy of get to the peasants first, then you can basically, the first point, the actions of the guerrillas and their capabilities, if you can get to the hearts and minds of the peasants first, you can reshape those actions however you want to tell the peasant class or whatever.
And I want to highlight there a little bit of like why such the focus on peasants. I think that some of it is just a numbers game, right? Obviously, just getting more people on your side. There's also something revolutionary movements I've talked about this before, sometimes called high risk activism.
When we did How to Blow Up a Pipeline.
Yes. We've talked about that concept before, but something that like social movement research has highlighted in talking about high risk activism is the idea of biographic availability, meaning like what is actually going on in your life that makes you more or less free to do this kind of thing, right? And there is also like Marxist-Leninism investment in peasants. There, like, I'm not saying there's not other stuff going on there, but in a very like pragmatic, practical sense, peasants are also people that have like less to lose, not in terms of their lives, but like they have been like stepped on, right, by this society, and so they have their jobs are not in an office where they're locked away for 12 hours a day, right? Like they have a lot more biographic availability to engage this, and there's a lot of them, and the potential for benefits, right? This is ultimately the battle that we see going on between the Bolivian army and the U.S. government side, and the revolutionary side is trying to fight about consciousness, right? Like, can we engage in consciousness raising to get them to understand how their situation is linked to ours and would be bettered by the revolution, whereas the Bolivian army and the U.S. government is trying to be like, don't let them be activated.
Yeah.
Don't let them be activated in that way.
And I think that is, again, a good counterpart, because I feel in the first one we have the structure is almost of the film itself is almost geographic, where you see like the map at the beginning and how they're going to take those individual states, kind of win the hearts and minds of the peasants. And there's a reason why it's not like that in this one, because this revolution just didn't work like that. And I think that's a good like mirror to the first one. And then we get Matt Damon. One of Matt Damon's. Matt Damon has so many movies where he just shows up that I didn't realize he was in. Euro Trip. He's the one that sings "Scotty Doesn't Know" in the punk band at the beginning of Euro Trip.
What?
Yeah, that's Matt Damon. That's the one I always think of. But yeah, he's got like a shaved head and a spike collar, and he sings that song.
That's crazy. I have not seen that movie since probably like 2006.
Me neither. I just.
Wow.
Yeah, so we get we talked about it a little bit, but essentially the Bolivian army, after working to keep the peasants from gaining their side, then they start an offensive. We see them basically forcing Che's guerrillas into the jungles, kind of off their heels. They're not in that same strategic position where they kind of control the area and can kind of burst into those outposts and storm them. They get pushed further and further into the jungles. We see whole Tanya and her whole column is basically decimated. And Che is eventually captured in that sequence we talked about where he's, asthmatic and just kind of firing his gun. And then I thought the ending was really powerful. I want to see, what did you think about specifically I really like, we get one of the only POV shots in the whole thing is we don't see Che shot. We see him shot from his own perspective and then like fade to black, which I think is really powerful. I think, and he comments on it a little bit, that I think is aware that he is going to become a martyr in this moment. Like even when he's captured, he knows almost immediately. He's like, it is now his job is martyrdom essentially. And they try to interrogate him and it doesn't work. And he kind of like, he kind of owns that one fucking dweeb that comes in with very few words, but makes him look.
Like kind of the Ubermensch.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. What I do love is that I don't think we commented on, but in order to get into the country in his disguise, he shaves his head into like classic male pattern baldness, just fringe. And what I really respect is that the movie just commits to that hair growing out for the next year. So while it is the sad part of his death, his hair is really funny in this moment because he's got like really long on the sides and then just like a short little mop on the top.
Yeah, there are no salons in the Bolivian jungle mountains.
Not at all.
Jungle mountains. Yep, that's me.
One thing I really, really love is that final shot, which is a flashback, which we don't even see in this movie. We see it in part one, but it's a flashback to them on the Grandma, which was the boat with him and Raul and Fidel, just kind of looking like hopeful and wistful, which I think is a pretty solid shot to end on as far as like him transitioning from a fighter to a martyr, essentially.
And I think also just like the contrast between like the myth and the man.
The young man. Really cool. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff to dig into on this, so I think we want to hit some of those big themes and stuff. I know you've got a few that you wanted to.
Yeah. So Craig, to start us off in this direction, want to hear like why, from your perspective, didn't it work in Bolivia? And like what, based on your viewing of the movie and the readings that you've done and stuff, propose about why it didn't work? Like what's the impression that you walk away with from all of this about the difference between Bolivia and Cuban revolutions?
Yeah. I'd say my main impression is that the Cuban Revolution had the most solidarity from those disparate factions, which we've kind of already talked on. Yeah, they might have disagreed, but it seemed like in Cuba it was for this common good that we're all fighting towards. We can quibble about stuff later. But by the time Che got to Bolivia and even earlier in the Congo, there were these multiple left-wing factions vying for legitimacy within these revolutions, which led to a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And ultimately, the revolutionary fervor kind of lacked the intensity that we saw in Cuba. I did want to talk about, I mentioned this briefly, but when I was in Chicago, I bought this book called I Embrace You with All My Revolutionary Fervor, which is a collection of letters that Che wrote between the years of 1947 and 1967. And in 65, while in Congo, I think this just kind of points out that lack of cohesion amongst those left forces. Che wrote to Fidel about this lack of cohesion amongst the revolutionaries, seemingly hinting also at their lack of dedication to these guerrilla tactics, saying there are too many armed men here in the Congo and not enough soldiers. Similarly, Che notes that the other leaders within the revolution lacked the commitment. He specifically singles out Gaston Somialat, who was the leader of the Simbas, for infighting and not fully committing to revolutionary action. So basically, I think when Che reached Bolivia and what we see in the movie, he's got a lot of armed men, but he doesn't have a lot of soldiers, in the sense that, you know, there was a solidarity amongst the guerrillas that he just doesn't have in Bolivia. Another interesting point in his letters, in the years leading up to the Bolivian Revolution, he sheds a lot of light on just why he had a hard time gaining the trust and solidarity of the peasant class. And this was really interesting. And he points out that a big part of it was that they did not have access to a lot of the shit he was reading. Really interesting letter in this book was he wrote to Armando Hart, who was the organizational secretary of the Cuban Communist Party, basically studying, he had been studying philosophy even more, but this time around, this was in 1965, so obviously he did not get the chance to do this, but he created in these letters like a 7-point outline plan that he had to basically translate and bring a lot of these Marxist-Leninist writings that he had studied to Latin America. Because I think he identified it as, yeah, there's a lot of people that have this like fervor in them, but don't have the like theory or the ways to express it, because so much of that was written in English or French or German or Russian. So that was an interesting thing that I read in his letters, him singling out specifically like, this is a bit of a problem that we don't have access to some of these really important works, right, which like he was trying to address. Yeah.
There. I did some readings as well, so we could include some information about kind of the structural and historical differences between Cuba and Bolivia, because you know who I am as a person, that likely affected these outcomes on a level that was like totally outside of the control of Che and the revolutionaries, right? So as Mark said, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. So I want to highlight some structural conditions and historical patterns that may have made the circumstances in Cuba more fertile and facilitative, and the circumstances in Bolivia more likely to fail. So there's this sociologist named Timothy P. Wickham-Crowley, great fucking name.
That is a good name.
Who has devoted his career to studying guerrilla insurgency. In 1992, he published a book called Guerillas and Revolution in Latin America, a comparative study of insurgents and regimes since 1956. So pretty helpful. Trying to put forth a grand theory of the criteria needed to support a successful revolution in Latin America. I'm going to organize what comes next around the 5 criteria he outlines. So we'll talk about them, but I'll say like 1, and then we'll talk about it, okay? So the first is peasant support, which usually is following eviction and violence faced by the peasants by the ruling, enacted by the ruling regime. So in terms of thinking about this in Cuba, we've talked about this a decent amount already, but to kind of put a finer point on it, between Cuba and Bolivia. Prior to 1952, Bolivia was still operating under a colonial feudal agricultural model. I read a historical source from the late 50s that said that at that time, as many of 3 million of Bolivia's 3.5 million population, like that overwhelming majority, were in peonage / not paid for their labor, crazy. Right? Like working land that they didn't own, that they weren't paid for. And in the wake of the 1952 upheaval, which we talked about earlier, the National Revolutionary Movement, MNR, did enact nationalization of the tin industry and agrarian reform. This means that agrarian reform had already been undertaken over a decade ago by the time of Che's involvement. This doesn't mean that the peasants were happy with their station, but that grievance and the specific peg that those grievances could hook onto weren't as straightforward as they were in Cuba. Additionally, we know that Barrientos, the president, the guy who was the president at the time that what we see in the movie is happening, the guy who was involved in the coup and overthrow of the MNR, spent 1966 appealing to and courting peasants, which we see in the movie, right? The second factor is guerrilla military strength. So, Craig, what do you think of the way the guerrillas' military prowess and strength is shown in Che Part 1 versus Che Part 2?
Yeah, I think, again, we kind of outlined it a lot, but there's just a diffusion of that revolutionary fervor that helped in Cuba. I think Cuba was just kind of like a strike of lightning where it was like quick, fast. I mean, it did take 2 years, but the amount of like land they took over with the amount of people they had, like it was like a, in and out, boom, boom, bam, like kind of take Cuba by storm. Whereas Bolivia, the fervor wasn't as strong. And actually, because I'm dumb and can only compare things to sports things that I like, I wrote something that now I'm getting self-conscious about, but I feel like the Cuban Revolution was like the 2020 Lakers, the COVID year, where like everything was thrown into disarray, nothing made sense, and like the Lakers had LeBron and could just kind of storm through and like fuck everything up and pull out a win or whatever. And then the Bolivian Revolution was like, they've got that. If you follow basketball as well, Hal, the Lakers have basically sucked shit ever since that year, despite consolidating immense power like Russell Westbrook and all these people, because they just don't. The sauce is gone, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I guess I'm bringing that to mean that they're, in addition to like the strategic things that we talked about, this movie does seem to depict just a lack. The guerrillas don't share the fervor that Che does, that we see in Part 1, I think. So is Che LeBron in this analogy? I think that's what I just said. Nice. Or LeBron is Che. But basically,
greatest of all time, baby.
Right. It just seems like we got him. We got the greatest of all time. There's no way we can lose. And that
maybe that only works for so much time.
Yeah, like, and I'm not saying that
the opening.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that Che saw himself as the greatest of all time. I think I'm saying like the fervor of the revolutionaries are like, now we can just coast. We got the goat, and it just kind of like the necessary pieces weren't all there.
Not everything
like
was
the Lakers.
While you were talking, I was also thinking, I did not write this here, but it just kind of popped into my head that maybe also the geography matters as it relates to the guerrilla military strength specifically, because in Part 1 we see that the approach, the strategy that's taken by the guerrillas is to, I don't remember the city, but that like I think it's way far to the south, like coastal
Sierra
army
Maestra.
base. Yes.
Yeah.
They take that, and that is really isolated from the rest of the Cuban army bases.
Yeah.
And so that are held by Batista's men. And so it wouldn't, part of what we see as a reoccurring theme really across all of it is that the military strength is like training matters, revolutionary fervor matters, but also like supplies matter.
Yep.
And based on what we see in the movie and what I'm reading about, like literally the geography of Bolivia and like where they were hiding in the mountains, is it was not really as possible to like find an army base, isolate it, block it off, and then carry that momentum, not just in terms of people's spirit and being inspirited by the fact that there is a victory, but like literally having guns and ammunition and the supplies that are present at that place.
And just by the like fact of Cuba being an island, if you can take a corner of it, then they can't, there's nowhere that they're going to come in from the other sides to get you. Whereas Bolivia, it wasn't as all kind of, it wasn't just one spot. They didn't have as straightforward of a plan of attack, I guess.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to the third characteristic that Wickham-Crowley outlines as being needed for a successful revolution is a divided ruling elite. I've talked about this before many times. I couldn't even tell you an episode because it's like a reoccurring thing, certainly, that I think about as it relates to politics. is that it bears out time and time again when elites are in conflict with each other, a window of political opportunity opens, right? So in really both of these movies, but especially, I don't know, in both of them, we don't see a lot of the other faction part. We see kind of key moments where enough to seed in that we understand what's going on.
And when we do, it's usually through Che's perspective, like,
right, with the exception of basically that one scene where we see the Americans telling the Bolivian president. But why do you think Soderberg made that choice? Like, what effect does that have on the storytelling, or what do we gain as an audience by being kind of more almost exclusively focused on the guerrillas' action?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think maybe obviously it's a movie about Che, I think, and I think it's kind of dicey waters because I think Soderberg did want to make a movie in tribute to this guy. My guess would be that Che probably would have hated this movie, like just the idea, because I think in the first movie we talked about how he does comment on the idea of like the great man of history theory, and that like there are no great men or whatever. And I think that's kind of a catch-22 for Soderberg to make, where he's like, yes, I want to respect that belief, but also I am making a movie about this guy that did great things. So I think maybe putting a lot of it through his eyes is what is going to do that without like lionizing him in that kind of way. And I think part 2 is more personal to Che because we see him in failure essentially. And I think that's to me, that's just more interesting as well, especially when compared to the first one. I think those are like success and failure are the two like dichotomies there. So I would say that probably the reason that he made the choice is just, and again, like reading interviews about how he wanted to take Malick's vision and make a counterpart to it as well. But I think it's just Soderbergh is showing that he, in part 1, that he is a leader who's gracious in victory, and in part 2 we see that he's also someone who's humble and defiant in defeat, and I think those work really well together. And they do create like a tonal shift, I think, where the first is hopeful and inspiring, and part 2 the tone is more desperate. And part 2 is more about the problems he runs up against and less about the revolution itself. I don't know, that's a really good question. I feel like my answer rambled, but I think we do get the clips of everything else, but it is so much through his eyes that I think, I don't know. I'm grappling with what I wrote and trying to bring it all together. But yeah, I really liked all of this and this discussion, and I'm still feeling like a dumb guy now that I can't fully come to an answer.
No,
but yeah,
I think you did come to an answer, and I think maybe like the kind of synthesizing statement is that it's like it allows for more of the like connection.
Yeah,
it allows these big broad ideas to be personalized
right.
for the screen.
Yeah.
To provide a door for the audience to walk through.
Yeah,
right.
Because I don't think Soderbergh doesn't seem interested in those other movements. He seems interested in those other movements as they relate to this person.
Right. A little G, little M great man.
Yeah.
and his journey, right?
Yeah.
That has a lot of political implications, but is not necessarily solely about the politics.
Yeah. Which also is interesting to me because, I think he is humble, a very humble person, and I do think he eschews that great man theory. But the ending is very interesting as well because he does recognize his place as little G, little M, great man.
It's very classic Marxist to ride the rails of the contradictions.
Yeah. But because he recognizes, I think, in me, I don't think he wants to die, but I also think he recognizes probably the best thing that's going to come out of the Bolivian Revolution at that point is that he's killed and becomes a martyr.
Well, and part of being a soldier or a strategist in general is knowing, right? A chess player is like knowing when you've been checkmated.
Yeah.
Like when there's the radical acceptance, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't make sense to fight against it. So the last couple of criteria for a successful revolution that he talks about are number 4, cross-class alliances. We talked about that a decent amount, so I don't have a lot of detail there. And then number 5, withdrawal of U.S. support for the old regime. And as it happens in Bolivia, we know that prior to 1966, 1967, the U.S. interfered by providing money, and bounced from the president of the MNR, Paz Ascensaro, to funding the post-coup president, Barrientos, that we see in this movie.
Yeah,
right.
And that also goes back.
We see them actively supporting them materially and otherwise.
And that fifth point that he has also goes back to what we see Che say at the UN speech, where he outlines the withdrawal of U.S. from Latin American, Caribbean countries too.
And then I have a few other things to chew on about, again, kind of the difference between Cuba and Bolivia and why we see differential results that didn't really neatly fit within Wickham-Crowley's typology. I think that we have to consider the enduring effects of the political party system in Bolivia that preceded the military junta, that was led by the MNR. So I talked about the president that we see, the Bolivian president that we see in Che Part 2, was part of the coup against the previous regime, which is the party that had undertaken the revolution in 1952. In fact, the president, Barrientos, was the vice president under the previous model, and then used the Bolivian army, or worked alongside the Bolivian army to instigate a coup, and then became the president, right? So if we think about the previous political party, the MRN, they fostered pluralism and factionalism within their party and in their coalition building, in contrast to the Cuban revolutionaries who pursued assimilation and centralization above all else. You can judge as you like, but the benefit of assimilation and centralization is that there's a singular voice advancing clear directives. In the alternative organization and the associated political culture, there is less ideological and operational discipline. So I read some historians that suggested these dynamics, coalition structured by overly diffuse, decentralized factionalism, also had the effect of engendering political apathy in the peasant class. So basically, in the 10 plus years prior to what we see as the current political situation in Bolivia, the peasants weren't kind of politically activated, right? So they were kind of distant anyway. They weren't primed for what was to come. And now, as we've mentioned, by this time, the MRN were no longer in power, but these kind of dynamics have a lasting power once political education, human capital, tactical repertoire, expectations about how political action is interwoven in your life and your consciousness that have been accruing over your life are not necessarily immediately aborted by a coup, right? Like, so what was all these people that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old have just lived through a decade where people just like weren't really primed to like buckle in and sacrifice everything for a singular organization. Like, the political system was much more like kind of everybody can take part in this pluralistic society. And so that just doesn't set up a revolutionary communist setting well. We also know that the MNR tended towards institutionalization, so they would kind of co-opt and integrate their disparate coalition into their government. So again, it's decentralized, but what this means is that like the union lead, the heads of the unions would hold positions in formal government rather than maintaining like a separate independent relationship. I think this probably had a lingering effect too. Che was so terribly disappointed by the miners' strike ending and them inking a deal with President Barrientos, but the miners' unions had just emerged from over a decade of formalized incorporation into and harmony with institutional politics. It's kind of hard to convince people to take that risk when what they're used to is like, well, that's what you do, is like you assimilate, you know, our org is in harmony with and assimilates into the government. And then finally, I think we should consider the role of repression. So Batista's regime was known to, as we talked about in the first episode, terrorize, coerce, and torture. Whereas Barrientos, at least in the immediate wake of the coup, was not known for like publicly, brutally, physically brutalizing his opponents. And though Paz, the previous president, was exiled, his other leaders like were able to return and basically did reintegrate in some form in a lot of, many of them did in the government. So repression, like the research on repression is interesting because repression can stop action, but it can also spur it by igniting fire under opponents' asses and changing the internal assessment of how necessary it is to mobilize now. Repression gets integrated into the calculus of risk and costs and benefits in different ways depending on its intensity. So basically, if repression, like what the research kind of shows is if repression is really horrible, like absolutely brutalizing, you may feel compelled to action because you have nothing to lose anyway and someone has to do something about this. If repression is really low, you may mobilize because the potential loss is minimal. However, if repression is kind of moderate, all these the scales in the middle, you may waver because the payoffs are less clear, the risks are pretty high, and the benefits of not doing anything aren't so punishing yet. And so I think that may play a role in the difference here, as well as like basically Batista was making it so that people were like, it is worth
immediate.
it. It is worth it to do this. Whereas like maybe where things were in Bolivia at that moment, it wasn't like quite to the crisis point yet. And this also ties into, I realized I should have included it earlier, this ties into those cross-class alliances also, because with Batista you also had rich people being like, fuck his shit, fuck this shit. That doesn't mean they were like fully on for the communist mission.
You can get people on your side without the theory if it's
right.
Do you want them to stop beating the shit out of you?
Does it serve their interests in the short term, right? And also it just creates division between elites. Whereas like that was not exactly the situation in Bolivia at the time.
Which I think is really interesting and probably a good segue into us talking about what movie we'll do next, because I think that idea of like there not being the repression, there kind of being a little bit of a, like you live in an exploitative country, but there's a little bit of a cushion from that heavy repression, is kind of the climate that he grew up in Argentina, where he was like, you know, Juan Perón wasn't like the most violent, repressive guy. There was a pretty strong middle class at the time in Argentina, but he was still firmly in the pocket of like capitalist interests and stuff. So I think that was a frustration that Che had talked about as being like, yes, we need revolution here, but it is also hard to spur people towards revolution when you have a functioning like middle class and not like the monster that you can point at or whatever. So
right, there are some number of people whose degree of exploitation is not immediately making it evident to them that they need to
it was
do
easier to
something.
convince Americans to invade Iraq because you could point to all the horrible shit that Saddam Hussein did, even if it didn't have anything to do with what we were necessarily there for. But it makes the response of the people more like emotional and immediate, I guess. Did that make sense as a comparison? Just the idea that it was easier for the hearts of the American people to be like, we should definitely invade Iraq because we can point to these shitty things that Saddam Hussein did, gassing his people and things like that, even though they had no bearing on the actual events. Or like
revealing the ideological process, right? Like that has to be constructed. And whether or not you have the opportunity to construct it for people depends on some of these structural conditions, right? I think the other thing, I think I mentioned this in the part one, I decided not to go into it here because I do think it fits better. I do want to go in our next episode dig into the Marxist-Leninist concept of vanguardism, and I think that aligns more closely with like Che's youth, and thinking about like, why would someone who is highly educated and relatively financially secure be forefronted in a campaign? And I think in America in the 21st century, we overwhelmingly view that with suspicion, whereas under a Marxist-Leninist model of the mid 20th century, that was viewed as necessary. So I want to dig into that a little because I think it's an interesting contrast compared to the way activism is approached in America now.
And for our next episode, we're going to watch The Motorcycle Diaries, which is the cinematic adaptation of Che's memoirs, traveling with his friend Alberto through South America, meeting miners, meeting lepers, getting real horny for people on Easter Island. No, Easter Island? Is that the one that's right off the coast? There's one thing where like, it's really, I've been reading the Motorcycle Diaries, and there's one where like, just like a bunch of horny bros are like, dude, the girls on the island though. And then like there's a part where they're just trying desperately to get to the island. I think it's Easter Islands. I can't remember.
I'll be curious to see if that's featured.
I want to see if it's in there too. But cool. Well, do we have anything else on Che part two? Part deux.
I don't know. I was just going to ask you if you feel like there's anything from either of these movies or in combination with them that you feel like is instructive or is like something you walk away with in terms of thinking about the U.S. and like our political
I
situation.
definitely talked about last time how this, kind of, I've read a lot of him since we started doing this, and it kind of had me reevaluate some of the things that I thought I knew about the Cuban Revolution and him and all that. So can you rephrase that question again? Because I think I got far afield already.
Yeah, just like what part of why I like the comparative stuff, right, is thinking about like, okay, it's easy enough to dissect and think about like, this is why what she did was or was not successful.
Yeah,
maybe not easy enough, but it is easier, right, to sit and reflect historically. I'm like, that didn't work. But like, are there things about Che, his political education, his ideology, his life, his tactics, his strategies that you think are relevant to the United States today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I think a lot of his ability to organize, I think, is relevant to organizing today and mobilizing people and things like that. Obviously, we're not in like a hot conflict like he was, but I think a lot of the organizing strategies, the way he talks to people, the way he relates to people, I think a lot of what we see, like maybe this is back to that vanguard aspect, but like a lot of the actually caring for people, actually like living your values, I think is something that leftists in the U.S. should practice.
I think the importance of him being a medical doctor is really not lost on me. And maybe I think that's something that I was not as aware of or sensitized to prior to us embarking on this.
And it's really subtle because like essentially he gets to go to these places and say like, let me show you what you could have or like what you're missing or what you need and things like that by virtue of him being a doctor.
Like, you should have this.
Yeah, you should have this. This is normal. Yeah. This is someone taking care of you is normal. Like, you need this. Yeah, that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, we'll see y'all again in 2 weeks.
Heck yeah. For the Motorcycle Diaries. Bye-bye.